All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon, and we are going to talk about rumors that I was asked to comment on coming out of the Terence Crawford camp in preparation for the Shawn Porter fight, that he was either knocked out or beaten up in sparring by a young fighter named Brian Norman Jr. We will, Cameron Dunkin, the manager of Brian Norman and of Boots Ennis, responds. Let's talk about what he had to say in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. So this is going to be a fun one, just a conversation about a rumor that was running around pretty rampantly around boxing. So it's something that pretty much at this point cannot be ignored. And that is Terence Bud Crawford, who is, in my opinion, the pound for pound #1 fighter in the world, who is preparing for a fight this Saturday night against Shawn Porter for the WBO welterweight championship. Ran into some trouble against a young up-and-coming fighter by the name of Brian Norman Jr. And the rumors were, when I first heard it maybe about 2 days ago, was that Brian Norman Jr. had knocked out Terence Crawford in a sparring match. And now, just today on the Boxing Voice, shout out to the Boxing Voice, Cameron Dunkin was asked questions about it, and he gave his answer. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that in this video. Make sure you stay to the end, and then where I give you my take on what the deal is. But in short, they were preparing for the fight. Brian Norman Jr., if you've not heard from him about him, I do believe he's a 140-pound contender, managed by or promoted by Cameron Dunkin. Very good fighter. If you've heard the name before, you've heard it in a scenario pretty much just like this, where there was rumors that he had made Gervonta Davis quit in sparring. I'm not sure if it was this year or last year, but in the relatively recent history, Brian Norman was supposed to have gotten in some really, really good work with Gervonta Davis, and Gervonta Davis got out of the ring. That's one of the things that Riley Romero was alluding to when he was talking smack about Gervonta Davis, and how if things aren't going how Gervonta Davis wants him in sparring, Gervonta Davis will quit in sparring. That is around this same thing with Brian Norman Jr. And now Brian Norman Jr. is supposed to have stopped Terence Crawford or beat up Terence Crawford in sparring. Now, this is my take on the matter. Or before I give my take, Cameron Dunkin was asked this question straight by Ness of the Boxing Voice, and what he said was that he was not there. However, he got calls from pretty much everybody involved. He had gotten a call from Bomac. He had gotten a call from Mr. Norman's father. He had gotten calls from other people. So that's both sides of the equation saying, that something had happened in other fighters. Saying something that, had happened in the sparring match. From what he said, though, he could not validate or verify that Terence Crawford had been knocked out, but that it was just a lot of very, very good work. Bomac said to Cameron Dunkin that he would hope that Cameron Dunkin would, help silence the rumors that Terence Crawford got knocked out. Brian Norman Jr., Sr. said that he said or mentioned that there was really good work and that his son had done a very, very good job in sparring, but he could not verify from either one of those that Terence Crawford had been knocked out. Okay, so this is my take on it. More than likely, Terence Crawford did not get knocked out. And if he had, nobody's going to say anything about it. But, really, this is kind of similar to what happened with Tyson Fury and Jared Anderson ahead of the Deontay Wilder fight. There's a lot of conversations about how people like Joseph Parker, Michael Hunter, Jared Anderson were really giving the business to Tyson Fury. And in fact, people said that Jared Anderson had Tyson Fury out on his feet in sparring. So, you hear these type of things going on before fights, but when the fight that actually took place happened, Tyson Fury won by knockout. Now, late afterwards, it came out that Tyson Fury had to have, surgery on both his elbows. for bone spurs, and that may actually have been one of the reasons that he postponed the fight, and maybe one of the reasons why he wasn't looking very good in sparring. So, for me, I don't really make much of it other than, I'm going to keep an eye out for Brian Norman Jr. That's what I'm going to do for sure. I'm going to look at that kid and make sure I watch his fights, see his tapes, because if he's somebody, first of all, that can get called into training camp with Terence Crawford to prepare for this fight, that means that he's a respected and a highly skilled fighter to get that type of work to begin with. Also, if he is competing at a high level with Terence Crawford, that's a good sign. However, there are things about sparring, like more than likely they had headgear on. They had, bigger gloves on. So there's and Terence Crawford may have just had an off day, right? Not have, or he had been working on something and trying to work on, something specifically for the fight, where it may have made, people who are spectators and looking on think that more was going on than was really going on. Because I'm not sure how many people would think that Brian Norman right now in this stage of his career could actually beat Terence Crawford. So, I just kind of take the whole thing with a grain of salt. There's not, however, I will say this, I'm not a boxer. So, for people that always want this sparring conversations and all this stuff to stay, what happens in sparring to stay in sparring. Look, man, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And just earlier this week, Terence Crawford came out and said something about what happened to Shawn Porter in sparring when Shawn Porter was supposed to have been, I forget who the guy was that he said, Jose Benavidez. Saying that Jose Benavidez had given, some years ago, had given Shawn Porter a lot of really good work. So if David Benavidez can do so, or Jose Benavidez can do something to Shawn Porter, what can I do? And that's just something that that Terence Crawford just said earlier this week. So, with Terence Crawford, it's kind of fair game to talk about it with Brian Norman Jr. if that's the case, where he wound up having had difficulties with the guy. However, all of that stuff is going to be, just fun memories, I guess, or legends to happen in the gym. There's a lot of legends about what happened with guys like Sugar Ray Leonard and Aaron Pryor, and when these guys would spar, how Aaron Pryor would get the best of Sugar Ray Leonard, and but the fight never happens. So that's just what it winds up being. You had the same type of conversations going on around Errol Spence Jr. and Floyd Mayweather Jr., where actually Errol Spence Jr. and Adrian Bronner. Like the first time that I had heard, well, not the first time that I heard, but one of the first things that I heard about Adrian Bronner, Errol Spence Jr. as a pro to really get me I'd heard about him as an amateur, but to really get me focused on him as a pro is that he had supposed to have beaten up Adrian Bronner so bad that Adrian Bronner started crying in the ring. And then later on he got the sparring against Floyd Mayweather, and people were like, Floyd Mayweather threw him out of the gym because Errol Spence was going so hard. So, I'm going to keep an eye out for Brian Norman Jr. on this, because it seems like, if he's getting good work in with Gervonta Davis and Terence Crawford, he's somebody that you need to pay attention to. But I'm not going to put too much weight on it as far as what it means for the fight between Shawn Porter and Terence Crawford. I think Terence Crawford is going to win the fight. The closer we get to the fight actually being made, the more people are starting to talk about a knockout taking place for Terence Crawford, and how they believe that more than likely Shawn Porter is going to be pressing Terence Crawford. Terence Crawford is going to step back and eventually time him, hit him with something big and get him out of there. I think that's what I'm looking forward to this week. And, and honestly, I hope it's not true that Terence Crawford got hurt against Brian Norman Jr. because, I don't want anything standing in the way of his, effectiveness in this fight with Shawn Porter, which is going to be a terrific fight. But anyway, that's my take on the matter. You let me know what you think in the comment section. Also, make sure you hit the like button in the video, subscribe to the channel. It's greatly appreciated. And with that, I'm out. Peace.